food release this, food release that. The word food release is always being thrown around like it's a gimmick. Food release doesn't really matter until you actually properly get your S-grind. Good day everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Frank Wallo and this channel is all about knife knowledge, reviews, unboxings, and head-to-heads. If you missed it, this is the first video after my small rebrand. Yes, this is the old logo, but let's just pretend it's the new logo. Today, we are going to be reviewing this absolutely gorgeous S-grind Nakiri from Jesse at Nordquist Designs in Kelowna, BC. Now, this is a knife that is a collaboration of many people. Before we get into that, disclaimer, this knife and accessories, the saya as well, were sent to me at no cost. However, in no way does that manipulate the type of review I put into this. My review, my words, my honesty cannot be bought. This is a collaboration. Why? Because when Jesse reached out to me, I think maybe I reached out to him just to tell me he had nice products, but essentially when we started to work together a few months ago, probably 6 months already, or a year to be honest, time passes by very quickly, I was letting him know that I thought his products were absolutely excellent, they looked great, but I was wondering how an S-grind knife actually performed. I also told him that an S-grind, in terms of the type of grind on the knife, I thought would be best suited for a Nakiri, and so we started to talk about Nakiri dimensions, what's my dream Nakiri if it were to have an S-grind, and the finished product is this right here, this gorgeous 180mm S-grind Nakiri. Now in terms of the more technical specs, I will be putting that up on screen if you want to know the belly depth, the height, the weight. The handle though, this is really where the name comes from. So Jesse, who was also a former designer, which is why his knives look absolutely sexy, Jesse, a year ago, just about, created a series called the Bastogne series. Now, it was the Bastogne Giotto. Those of you who are wondering, like, Bastogne, what does that even mean? Funny enough, I found out that is the type of wood, more specifically walnut. And so this knife has a Bastogne walnut handle, and it has a sycamore bolster. Now, about this knife. 52-100 steel, full carbon steel, no stainless steel jacket, S-grind milled, again, Bastogne handle, sycamore bolster, but that's not where it stops, and that's also not where it starts. When I say that this was a collaboration of many people, what I also mean is Jesse was kind enough not only to send me the knife to see what I thought about it, but he has someone who is working on sayas for the first time and wanted to kind of get a feel for how would the saya paired with Nakiri look. And so this saya here is the contribution of two other artists. The saya itself is from Fortin with the saya pin. And I'm not sure if you've noticed how beautiful this is on the front of the saya, but this is pyrography done by Alexandra Davies, I believe also from Kelowna. Now, the information of both these artists, because to me this was a full package, it wasn't just a Nakiri that was sent, I will put everyone's contact information in the video description below. And so, to kind of resume what Jesse sent me, he sent me a beautiful saya and saya pin made by Fortin. The pyrography was made by Alexandra Davies, though fun fact, Jesse did reach out to my friend Craig from Craig's Kitchen Rocks and asked him, you know Frankie pretty well, what type of design would he like? And so that was a collaboration between Jesse, between Craig, and between Alexandra to figure out what type of wood burn image I would like, and look, they knocked it out of the park. And then of course the Nakiri itself from Jesse at Nordquist Designs. Now, the first thing I typically notice when I unbox a knife, and the packaging was fantastic, but it's the handle. In this case, I gotta say, the handle is amazing, but I've never seen a saya with pyrography on it. To me, really it was about the full package. I was absolutely impressed with the saya, the pyrography, and I'm absolutely in love with this Nakiri. I've been using it pretty much non-stop for about a month. When the knife arrived, it essentially had a matte gunmetal finish, and I started to use it immediately. One of the first things I cut. When, again, I think S-grind, I think it's so gimmicky. You know, they talk about a Damascus knife of a certain steel having better food release potential. To be honest, it's all crap, okay? It's all crap until you get into an S-grind knife or you get something like a Takeda, which is behind the camera. Most of my Takedas, because of their compound type S-grind knife, just because of the way he hand hammers the actual steel, those have excellent food release, but otherwise, when I hear food release, it is synonymous with S-grind, and this is my first proper S-grind knife. And so of course, wanting to acknowledge the potential of an S-grind knife, I took to a potato right away, and you'll see some of that footage here on screen. Now, I use the knife, and as you know, kind of same thing I do with my head-to-head, is I like to use the knives in ways that push them outside of their boundary in terms of what they are suited to do. When you think Nakiri, you would think, well, clearly he's cutting potatoes, and he's cutting bell peppers, and maybe a small radicchio. Well, I also use it on things like a cherry tomato. I also use it on things like, I think I was filleting short ribs. And clearly this isn't a butchery knife, but again, just to see how it performs, because there is no point in collaboration. There is no point in Jesse taking the time to kind of bounce ideas with me back and forth if I test it within its narrow limit of what it is best intended to do. And when I say I use this knife in ways that are not typical, this isn't a yusuba, but yet I still use it for katsuramuki on a carrot, just for fun, because I thought, well, it has a relatively straight edge, but of course it's very deep, so how's the katsuramuki going to work in my hand? I gotta say, honestly, I was super surprised. I think, unfortunately, I didn't film that part, but I think any type of quality drawback from my rotary peeling is from my technique and not the knife itself, and so the knife handled itself even really well for rotary peeling. Surprise. Now I can tell you with the potato, absolutely blown out of the water. It was the dream of a knife that I finally got into my hands. Having zero food release, or barely any food release, does it really change the way the potato tastes or the meal that comes with the potato? No. But is it absolutely fun to use? Heck yes. And so I used it on potatoes, I used it on cherry tomatoes, bell peppers. This knife performs really, really well where it should. Where I had some issues with it, was I wish that it had more bite, right? More bite for things like a cherry tomato or the skin of a bell pepper. And so what I did is I put a 1K Shapton glass edge on this knife, and then I tested it against a cherry tomato again. And as you can see in the footage, I was very, very pleased. In terms of craftsmanship, this handle, this blade, is about as good as it gets from even some of the top Japanese kitchen knife smiths out there, okay? What I mean is, the contouring is fabulous on the handle, on the sycamore bolster. By the way, this is spalted sycamore for the saya, and so matching wood for both the bolster as well as, or I guess you can call it spacer, as well as the saya. The spine is thick, but it tapers. It's very well rounded, it's very well finished. I absolutely love the milled S-grind. His logo is super classy. I really like it, just kind of like the calligraphy type signature. You can definitely tell that he was a designer prior to making knives. The balance of the knife sits just about here, so just a little forward to the pinch grip, but he's got this perfectly contoured choil, which is at a bit of a strange angle. And so one of the first things I did too is I put it on my knife block, because you know I like to keep knives that I'm going to be using on my knife block, and I noticed that the heel of the knife was sticking out of the block. Not a big deal, but it's one of those small things that I kind of like to communicate to the smith and say, just so you know, if someone were to happen to have a knife block and would sit it flush against the knife block, your heel would stick out. How's that mitigated? Easy. All I had to do was essentially angle it. Now it does end up taking the space of 1 or 2 knives, but it's still a solution. In terms of cutting performance, as I said, I've been very, very pleased. One of the first things I noticed, and this was really odd, we went back and forth with it a few times, is the steel was giving off a smell that I could only explain as being one of the strongest reacting steel smells that I've ever experienced in my life. I even wrote it down in my feedback form for Jesse. I said, like, what's up with the steel? Why is it smelly? Funny enough, it's just because it still had the, I'm very bad at washing even my vegetables when I'm cooking. I had forgotten to wash the blade, and so it still had some residual oil on it when he sent it to me to kind of just protect it from oxidizing in transport. Once I cleaned it, it didn't smell. I thought maybe it was a property of 52-100 carbon steel. Turns out it was just the way the oil was reacting with both the steel, because it's a reactive steel, but as well as with the food that I was cutting. I'm sure some of you out there are even asking the question, well, Frankie, what makes good food release? Like, what is a quality in the knife that is going to help with food release. And why is an S grind, that characteristic that you're mentioning, does help with food release? And it's really very simple. It's a lot like single bevel knives, right? So single bevel having a cutting angle only on one side, whereas the other side is relatively flat. Here in an S grind, instead what you have is, it is double bevel, but shortly above the primary cutting edge, it is milled inwards. And so that is creating kind of synonymous to a single bevel, but now on both sides. So as the food creeps up past the primary cutting edge, it essentially finds itself in an area on the knife where the steel is going in, creating an air pocket, helping with that food release. Now it's going to work best when the item that you are cutting is going to go past the primary cutting edge, past where it's milled, and at least somewhere between where the milling starts and the top. Why? Because if you're cutting something like when I cut garlic, and the garlic didn't even reach the top of the S grind, the reason the garlic sticks is because, well, that S grind isn't being given a chance to properly work, right? There needs to be food that crawls into the S grind space so that the air can do its job, which is to help with food release. If the food you're cutting is below the S grind, no bueno, it's gonna stick. If the food you're cutting is really, really tall, fantastic. If the food you're cutting lands somewhere in the middle of the S grind, then it's really going to depend on the food itself. If, say, it was, let's pretend garlic is this tall, which it isn't, but garlic being an item that is super, super sticky, it would stick here. If it reached about halfway up the S grind mill, it might still stick, it might not, but essentially the best items for S grind knife is going to be an item that goes past that primary bevel into the S grind cavity. That is something I noticed. So yes, the garlic stuck. Something like a cherry tomato can stick if it's really, really small, but anything else that goes past into the S grind cavity, that's where the food release really is gonna shine. Now, in terms of how I feel about this knife, my review after a month, I really don't have many complaints, I'll be honest. Like, one of the only complaints I had was something silly like, Jesse, why does your steel smell, right? And once we figured it out and it didn't smell anymore, it wasn't that big of a deal. It wasn't even that big of a deal that it smelled. It was just so peculiar. I've reviewed many knives and never have I thought, this knife smells funny. And so it was just residual oil. Therefore, the lesson is, wash your knife when you buy it. A brand new knife needs to be washed just like a brand new glass. But honestly, even the handle, like initially I thought this is a gorgeous handle. I love walnut and I love olive wood, and though this isn't olive wood, it kind of gives me olive wood vibes with the sycamore. But the walnut handle I thought might be too big for my small hands because it is quite a large handle. But as you'll see in the profile picture, it's so well contoured that it just fits really well. And I love the choil. I love how polished it is. It's very comfortable to use for 30 minutes, for an hour, because I have used this knife for up to an hour, and I've used it on so many different food items, from cherry tomatoes, like I said, to using it as a butchery knife just for fun. Now, it performs exactly where you would think it best performs, as a Nakiri would, on things like potatoes and bell peppers. Where it didn't do so well was on something like, say, garlic, and the why is going to be really funny. As you can see from the front of his knife, it's not a K-tip. It's, if anything, more of a reverse tanto, but then you have that really little slope from, I guess this is technically the tip, to like the secondary tip. And so when I was cutting garlic, and of course garlic being very small, 180 millimeters, not exactly being the length of a knife maybe suitable for slicing garlic, but I found that from a vision perspective, I was having trouble slicing the garlic this way because, let's call it, that secondary tip was getting in the way of my line of sight. So something like garlic I wouldn't recommend, but just about anything else, yes, especially after I put a 1K finish on it. What I like about Jesse is, I think when we converse about this, he's super open-minded, right? I told him, look, I love your knife. I think it has excellent fit and finish. I love the look of the steel, especially when I got it that matte gunmetal look. So sexy, especially with the walnut handle and the bolster. Now, of course, after I put an edge, I kind of polished the cutting edge a little bit better, but it performs for me personally better on something like a bell pepper skin or even cherry tomato. And Jesse did tell me, funny enough, that in terms of how he sharpens his blades, I think he finishes it on a 500 wheel. And so we started talking about things like, well, maybe the grit on a wheel is different. It's a little closer to sandpaper compared to a whetstone. So super open-minded about my feedback. It's been very easy to communicate with him. These are Canadian made knives. It's my second Canadian made knife that I have reviewed. I've also reviewed a knife from Casey from Lynn Valley Forge in North Vancouver. I feel very honored that people trust me to try their knives, to send them to me. Again, the fact that this came with a saya, which I love, this makes it easy for me to transport, but it's not just a saya to cover the blade. This is a piece of art, as is this. And so Jesse, Alexandra, Dan, Craig even for the design inspiration. Thank you all for making this possible, for making this happen. I'm in love with my 180mm S-grind Nakiri. Again, this is the Bastogne Nakiri prototype. What does that mean, prototype? It means this is the first one of the Bastogne series. Rather than making it available to the public, Jesse thought he would send it to me for some feedback. And I do imagine that very shortly he will be opening up the line to this limited series, because that's what the Bastogne series represents. It's a limited number of knives that he makes in this style, that he makes specifically with the Bastogne walnut. And so keep an eye out on his Instagram. Again, a link to his account as well as Alexandra and Dan's will be in the video description below. Jesse, thank you so much. I don't think I need any other Nakiris. Everything else, sure, I have 2, 3 Gyutos, but a Nakiri to me was always meant to have great food release. This one has it. I always thought Nakiris that were 165mm were a little bit short, which is why I told Jesse, please make a 180mm version. Honestly, it kind of ticks the boxes everywhere I needed it to for a Nakiri. Thank you so much. Hope you guys have enjoyed this. If you want to see some more food demos, stick around. I'll be putting some footage right after this. And until then, see you next time.